In 1922, a man stood before a Weimar court facing imprisonment for homosexuality, a charge that routinely destroyed ordinary lives. Yet moments later, his criminal record was wiped clean, his wealth untouched, and his status fiercely protected. That man was Prince Eitel Friedrich of Prussia, son of Kaiser Wilhelm II, and great-grandson of Queen Victoria. This is the story of a royal bloodline that bought immunity from the law. The year was 1883. The German Empire, under the absolute rule of the House of Hohenzollern, was accelerating toward the height of its militaristic and industrial pride. European society at the turn of the 20th century was bound by incredibly strict moral codes, and nowhere was this more absolute than in the Prussian court. Kaiser Wilhelm II, a man obsessed with martial glory and imperial strength, expected his sons to be the living, breathing embodiments of those same virtues. They were raised not merely as children, but as symbols. From the moment they could walk, they were placed in military uniforms, taught to revere the army, and instructed to project an image of unshakable masculine authority. Prince Eitel Friedrich carried an additional, invisible burden. Through his grandmother, he possessed the direct bloodline of Britain's Queen Victoria. This made him a central figure in the interconnected web of European royalty, a man who frequently attended state events in London, St. Petersburg, and Vienna. He was constantly under the watchful eye of the international press, representing the prestige of the establishment. Yet beneath the polished brass buttons and the flawless public discipline, the reality of human nature was quietly clashing with these impossible expectations. Many historians and biographers note that from a young age, the prince struggled to reconcile the rigid demands of his station with an internal reality that the German Empire strictly forbade. In Germany during this era, paragraph 175 of the National Criminal Code explicitly outlawed homosexual acts between men. It was a severe law enforced with brutal life-destroying efficiency against the working classes and the poor. A mere accusation could lead to the loss of a career, social ostracization, and years of hard labor. Yet historically, the ruthless application of this law often paused respectfully at the wrought iron gates of the royal palaces. The elite lived in a fragile ecosystem of open secrets, protected by their immense wealth, provided they never allowed their private lives to publicly embarrass the crown. By 1906, the dynastic pressure for Prince Eitel Friedrich to conform and produce heirs had reached its inevitable peak. To secure the royal lineage, pacify the public, and project an image of domestic stability, the imperial family arranged a marriage. His bride was Duchess Sophia Charlotte of Oldenburg. She was a woman of impeccable pedigree, widely recognized for her beauty and her graceful adherence to royal protocols. On the surface, their wedding was a spectacle of absolute dynastic triumph. Thousands gathered in the streets of Berlin to cheer, and newspapers across the continent celebrated the union of two great historical houses. But when the grand public ceremonies ended, the cheering faded, and the heavy mahogany doors of their private residence were closed. The reality of their union was profoundly different. Historical accounts, memoirs from courtiers, and later legal documents paint a deeply somber picture of this marriage. It was, by all modern definitions, a strategic alliance designed primarily to conceal the prince's true sexual orientation. Princess Sophia Charlotte found herself trapped in an intensely lonely and suffocating existence, while she dutifully fulfilled her public obligations, attending galas and charity events with a practiced smile, Her private life was marked by a chilling isolation. Several historical sources suggest that the prince largely abandoned his wife to her own devices shortly after the wedding. He retreated into a private, hidden world that the public and his wife were never meant to access. Sophia endured this emotional exile for years. She was bound by a strict sense of duty and the terrifying prospect of initiating a royal scandal that would shame both her family and the empire. She lived in the agonizing space between public adoration and private neglect. The breaking point for the royal couple did not occur in the shadows, but in the cold, unforgiving light of the Weimar legal system. In 1921, Eitel Friedrich found himself in a Berlin criminal court. He was not there for matters of morality, but for financial corruption. As the German economy began its catastrophic post-war collapse, the prince was convicted of fraudulently transferring 300,000 marks abroad to protect his wealth. He was found guilty and fined 5,000 marks. For a man of his immense inherited fortune, the penalty was little more than a minor administrative fee, blatantly highlighting how the Weimar justice system often operated differently for the aristocratic elite. However, the true public humiliation arrived a year later. In 1922, Prince Eitel Friedrich initiated a legal battle that would catastrophically backfire. He sued 4 German newspapers for libel after they published explosive allegations regarding his wife's private life. The aggressive, newly liberated Weimar press, no longer constrained by imperial censorship, eagerly turned the trial into a national spectacle. The courtroom proceedings publicly confirmed what the newspapers had claimed. Princess Sophia Charlotte had engaged in an affair with Baron von Plettenberg. The establishment that had shielded the Hohenzollerns for decades was powerless against the relentless media exposure. Every society hostess in Europe and every citizen reading the daily papers on the streets of Berlin now knew the brutal truth about their marriage. The facade of the loyal royal wife was irreparably shattered. In 1926, 4 years after the trial exposed the reality of her life to the world, Sophia Charlotte made a move that shocked the remnants of the German aristocracy. She filed for divorce. To proactively and publicly divorce the son of the Kaiser was a calculated rejection of the establishment's demand for silent suffering. She eventually remarried in 1927 to a former police officer named Harold von Hedemann. By choosing a life of quiet normalcy over grand, agonizing royal pretense, she decisively reclaimed her agency, stepping out of the dark shadow of the scandal and leaving her former husband to face the ruins of his reputation. While his exact fate remains lost to history, the brutal mechanics of Weimar justice suggest he vanished into a penal system that offered no mercy to the working class. Left completely alone in his sprawling Potsdam estate, Prince Eitel Friedrich was now a man fundamentally unmoored from his own identity. He had lost his imperial title when the monarchy fell in 1918. He had lost his prestigious military command. He had now lost his wife, a critical symbol of his societal standing. Worst of all, his personal reputation was permanently, irreparably tainted by the very public, very sordid details of his private life. Yet the deep-seated arrogance of the Prussian elite does not simply evaporate in the face of public disgrace. Eitel Friedrich still fiercely believed he had a vital role to play in the destiny of the German nation. He refused to fade into the quiet, anonymous retirement that his family desired for him. Refusing to fade into quiet retirement, the prince turned his attention to the extreme right-wing movements that were rapidly gaining momentum in the Weimar Republic. He positioned himself as a highly visible figure in Der Stahlhelm, the Steel Helmet, a massive, fiercely nationalistic paramilitary organization composed of World War I veterans. He aggressively threw himself into the theater of right-wing nationalism, standing on raised platforms in his old military uniforms, reviewing endless parades of marching men. For Eitel Friedrich, these paramilitary groups were not just a way to rebuild his shattered public image, they were a political weapon. He, along with other conservative elites, cynically believed they could use these aggressive factions to crush the Republic and eventually restore the monarchy to its rightful place. But the Weimar Republic in the late 1920s was a political powder keg, and the forces the prince was attempting to harness were entirely beyond his control. The political movements he was aligning himself with were not merely nostalgic veterans clubs parading on the weekends. They were the fertile breeding ground for a much darker, far more destructive political force that was quietly gathering unstoppable strength in the beer halls of Munich. The elite classes of Germany, including Eitel Friedrich and the surviving members of the Hohenzollern family, arrogantly believed they could use these aggressive right-wing factions as blunt tools to crush the communists, dismantle the Republic, and eventually restore the monarchy to its rightful place. They believed they were the ultimate masters of the political game, entirely confident that their ancient bloodlines, their land ownership, and their vast wealth would always keep them safely in control of whatever forces they unleashed. They were entirely, catastrophically wrong. By attempting to rebuild his own ruined personal reputation through these extremist populist groups, Prince Eitel Friedrich was blindly walking into a political storm that would soon sweep away the very last remnants of his royal privilege. He was aligning himself with men who did not respect crowns, but only respected absolute brutal power. He was stepping into an era that would bring him face to face with a new regime that possessed a ruthlessness and a capacity for destruction that even the haughty architects of the Prussian Empire could not possibly comprehend. The Ares. Autocratic elite of Germany made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation in the early 1930s. Men like Prince Eitel Friedrich, holding tightly to the remnants of their imperial titles and their vast land holdings, looked at the rising National Socialist movement with a mixture of aristocratic disdain and calculated opportunism. They looked at Adolf Hitler, a former corporal with no pedigree, no wealth, and no formal education, and believed they could control him. They viewed the violent populist energy of the Nazi Party as a blunt instrument. In the arrogant minds of the Prussian nobility, they would simply use this radical movement to crush the communists, dismantle the chaotic Weimar Republic, and eventually clear the path for the restoration of the Hohenzollern monarchy. Prince Eitel Friedrich, desperate to erase the humiliating public stain of his 1922 blackmail trial and his subsequent divorce, threw his remaining social weight behind the right-wing nationalist factions. He stood proudly in his World War I uniforms, reviewing parades of the Stahlhelm paramilitary forces. He aligned himself with the aggressive, hyper-masculine rhetoric of the extreme right. He desperately needed the German public to view him as a stern, unyielding soldier of the fatherland, not as the disgraced royal who had been dragged into a criminal court for sleeping with his chauffeur. It was a massive psychological performance, a calculated attempt to use extreme political nationalism as a shield for his deeply compromised personal life. But the elite classes fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the beast they were feeding. When Hitler assumed absolute power in 1933, the trap violently snapped shut. The new regime had absolutely no intention of sharing power with the old aristocracy, and they certainly had no intention of restoring the Kaiser. The National Socialists despised the old royal families, viewing them as weak, archaic relics responsible for the loss of the First World War. The Politi, Cal organizations that Prince Eitel Friedrich had used to rebuild his image were swiftly neutralized. The Stahlhelm, the proud veterans organization he had paraded with, was forcibly absorbed into the Nazi Sturmabteilung, the SA. The independent conservative factions were banned or assimilated. The prince and his peers suddenly woke up to a terrifying reality. They were no longer the masters of the political game. They were entirely powerless subjects trapped inside a ruthless, totalitarian police state. The wealth and the bloodlines that had shielded the prince during the Weimar era meant absolutely nothing to the Gestapo. Then came the ultimate terrifying irony of Prince Eitel Friedrich's life. The political regime he had flirted with, the extreme right-wing ideology he had used to mask his own homosexuality, suddenly turned its lethal attention toward men exactly like him. In 1935, the Nazi government drastically tightened paragraph 175, the exact same law the prince had been convicted under a decade earlier. But the Weimar courts, with their fines and their discreetly sealed records, were gone. The justice system was now controlled by Heinrich Himmler and the SS. Under the new regime, the persecution of homosexual men shifted from a legal issue to a matter of systematic industrial extermination. The Gestapo actively hunted men who violated paragraph 175. Neighbors turned against neighbors. Police raided underground bars. Men were arrested, beaten into confessions, stripped of their citizenship, and shipped to concentration camps like Dachau and Sachsenhausen, where they were forced to wear the pink triangle. The survival rate for homosexual prisoners in the camps was staggeringly low. They were subjected to brutal medical experiments, worked to death in the quarries, and systematically murdered. Situated in his sprawling, quiet estate in Potsdam, Prince Eitel Friedrich watched this machinery of death activate across the country. The psychological terror he must have experienced during these years is almost impossible to quantify. He was living on borrowed time. The Gestapo kept meticulous files, and they absolutely knew the details of his 1922 trial. The blackmail, the letters, the chauffeur, the conviction. It was all a matter of historical record. In the eyes of the Nazi ideology, the prince was a degenerate, a moral contaminant to the purity of the German race. Yet, the SS never kicked down the doors of Villa Ingenheim. The Gestapo never dragged the aging prince onto a transport train. Why did the ruthless Nazi machine spare him, while it brutally slaughtered tens of thousands of ordinary men for the exact same actions? The answer lies in the deeply cynical, highly calculated political strategy of the Third Reich. While Hitler despised the Hohenzollerns, he was acutely aware that the old Prussian royalty still commanded residual respect among the highest-ranking generals of the Wehrmacht. The German army in the 1930s was still heavily officered by conservative aristocrats. Arresting the son of the Kaiser, branding him a homosexual degenerate, and throwing him into a concentration camp would have caused massive, unnecessary friction with the military elite whose loyalty Hitler desperately needed to wage his coming wars. Furthermore, the Nazi propaganda machine was obsessed with projecting an image of absolute German superiority to the rest of the world. A public, international spectacle, highlighting the sexual deviance of Queen Victoria's great-grandson would have been a chaotic distraction. It was politically safer and far more effective to simply neutralize the prince through silent intimidation. Therefore, Eitel Friedrich was allowed to live, but his life was reduced to a state of absolute paranoid isolation. His survival was not a testament to his power, it was a testament to his irrelevance. He was effectively muzzled, confined to the gilded cage of his estate. He was placed under the constant invisible surveillance of the state. He knew that his phones were likely tapped, his mail intercepted, and his remaining staff questioned by the secret police. The man who had once stood at the pinnacle of the German Empire, who had commanded armies and moved through the highest courts of Europe, was now a terrified prisoner in his own home. He was forced to live in absolute silence while the regime systematically hunted and killed men who shared his sexual identity. He possessed the influence to speak out, the wealth to fund escapes, and the international connections to raise an alarm, but he did absolutely nothing. He prioritized his own survival and the preservation of his remaining privileges over any sense of solidarity or basic human courage. It was the ultimate defining act of aristocratic self-preservation. Eitel Friedrich retreated entirely into the shadows, a forgotten relic of a dead empire, watching from behind heavily draped windows as the nation he once expected to rule descended into absolute barbarism. The heavy iron gates of his Potsdam estate protected him from the Gestapo, but they also locked him away with the ghosts of his own hypocrisy, leaving him to face the twilight of his life in profound, agonizing irrelevance as the Second World War ignited around him. When the air raid sirens first began to wail across the skies of Berlin in September 1939, signaling the outbreak of the Second World War, Prince Eitel Friedrich of Prussia was a man trapped entirely in the past. He was in his late 50s, living in profound isolation behind the heavy stone walls of Villa Ingenheim in Potsdam. 25 years earlier, during the outbreak of the First World War, he had been a towering figure of the German Empire. He had commanded the First Foot Guards. He had ridden at the front lines, and his photograph had been plastered across national newspapers as a symbol of unshakable Prussian martial glory. Now, as a new and far more destructive war consumed the continent, he was reduced to a silent, irrelevant spectator. The military uniforms he had so proudly worn during his aggressive parades with the right-wing Stahlhelm in the 1920s now hung uselessly in his closets. The Nazi regime, heavily invested in its own manufactured mythology, had absolutely no use for an aging, disgraced royal. The psychological toll of this forced irrelevance must have been suffocating. Eitel Friedrich had spent his entire life defining his self-worth through his proximity to military power and his absolute superiority over the working classes. Now the common soldiers of the Wehrmacht were marching across Europe, while the great-grandson of Queen Victoria was effectively confined to house arrest by a totalitarian state that viewed him with deep, paranoid suspicion. The absolute collapse of the Hohenzollern family's remaining influence occurred in the spring of 1940, driven by an event that deeply panicked the highest levels of the Nazi command. In May of that year, Eitel Friedrich's nephew, Prince Wilhelm of Prussia, the eldest son of the former crown prince, was killed in action during the invasion of France. When his body was brought back to Germany for burial, something entirely unexpected happened. The Nazi leadership had assumed the public had forgotten the royal family. Instead, an estimated 50,000 people silently gathered in the streets of Potsdam to mourn the fallen prince. It was a massive, spontaneous display of residual loyalty to the old empire, and it terrified Adolf Hitler. Hitler was acutely aware that a significant portion of his highest-ranking generals still harbored secret monarchist sympathies. The sight of 50,000 citizens mourning a Hohenzollern was viewed as a direct, unacceptable threat to the absolute authority of the Führer. In response, Hitler issued the Prinzenerlass, or the Prince's Decree. This brutal political order categorically banned all members of the former royal houses of Germany from participating in frontline combat, and eventually discharged them from the armed forces entirely. For Eitel Friedrich, watching this unfold from the isolation of his estate, the message was unmistakable. The decree was the final definitive severing of his bloodline from the destiny of the German nation. The regime was explicitly declaring that the royal family was not a patriotic asset, but a dangerous political liability that needed to be erased from the public consciousness. Any lingering delusion Eitel Friedrich might have held about using his military background to reclaim his lost honor was completely destroyed. He was permanently locked out of the only world he truly understood. As the war raged on, the prince's isolation deepened into a grim, lonely endurance. Some historical accounts suggest that the halls of Villa Ingenheim grew increasingly silent. The bustling staff of servants, valets, and aides that had once catered to his every whim was drastically reduced by wartime conscription and economic rationing. The man who had once risked his entire royal standing to engage in reckless, passionate encounters with a working-class chauffeur was now surrounded by empty rooms and the fading ghosts of his own colossal mistakes. The contrast between his quiet, aristocratic decay and the violent reality of the world outside his gates is deeply unsettling. Just a few miles away in Berlin, the Gestapo was ruthlessly enforcing paragraph 175, the very law Eitel Friedrich had been convicted of violating in 1922. Men who shared his sexual desires were being hunted down, dragged from their homes, and sent to perish in the brutal conditions of Sachsenhausen and Dachau. The prince remained safe from the concentration camps, shielded by the invisible, lingering aura of his royal blood and the regime's desire to avoid a messy public scandal with the conservative military elite. But his survival was stripped of all dignity. He lived because he was deemed too pathetic to kill. In June 1941, the final pillar of his old world collapsed. His father, the exiled Kaiser Wilhelm II, died in the Netherlands at the age of 82. Because of the ongoing war and the deep political tensions with the Nazi government, the funeral in Dorn was a tightly controlled, highly restricted affair. The grand, sweeping state funeral that would have paralyzed Europe under the old empire was replaced by a quiet burial in exile. Eitel Friedrich, in failing health and politically neutralized, was forced to confront the absolute permanent death of the era that had created him. The German Empire was gone. His father was dead. His ex-wife, Princess Sophia Charlotte, had long since rebuilt her life with another man. And Emil Treschau, the chauffeur who had cracked the facade of his life wide open, had vanished into the unforgiving machinery of a justice system that only punished the poor. By the winter of 1942, Eitel Friedrich's physical health began to rapidly mirror his political reality. The physical strength that had defined his youth, the rigid military bearing he had used to mask his deep internal conflicts, finally gave way. He suffered from a series of ailments exacerbated by the severe stress of his circumstances and the grim realities of wartime Germany. He was no longer the arrogant prince standing in a Weimar courtroom, watching his elite handlers buy his freedom. He was simply a tired, broken man waiting for the end. On December 8, 1942, Prince Eitel Friedrich of Prussia died in his bed at Villa Ingenheim. He was 59 years old. Outside his windows, the brutal winter was freezing the German armies in the ruins of Stalingrad, marking the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. There were no massive crowds in the streets for Eitel Friedrich. There were no state proclamations, no grand military parades, and no international outpourings of grief. The Nazi press heavily censored the news of his passing, eager to ensure that the death of a Hohenzollern prince did not distract the German public from the desperate demands of total war. He was quietly buried in the antique temple in the park of Sanssouci, a magnificent resting place built by his ancestors. Yet his interment felt less like a royal honor and more like the sweeping of dust under a heavy rug. The heavy stone doors of the antique temple at Sanssouci closed in December 1942, effectively sealing away the physical remains of Prince Eitel Friedrich. For the surviving members of the Hohenzollern family, his quiet death during the darkest days of the Second World War was likely viewed as a massive relief. The man who had nearly destroyed the royal reputation 2 decades earlier was finally gone, and his secrets were buried with him. The German establishment fully expected his 1922 trial to become nothing more than a forgotten footnote in the chaotic history of the Weimar Republic. But physical death rarely guarantees historical silence. When the Third Reich collapsed in absolute ruin just 3 years later in 1945, the meticulously guarded gates of the Prussian elite were blown wide open. As the Soviet Red Army captured Potsdam and the surrounding estates, the landscape of German power was permanently fractured. The grand villas that had sheltered the royal family were ransacked, repurposed, or destroyed. More importantly, the massive state archives, including the highly sensitive police and court records of the Weimar era, fell into the hands of the occupying forces and were subsequently scattered across a divided Germany. The carefully constructed wall of silence that the conservative judges and aristocratic fixers had built around Prince Eitel Friedrich began to crack. For decades following the end of the war, the story of the prince and his chauffeur lay dormant. Post-war Germany was entirely consumed with the monumental task of physical reconstruction and the deep psychological reckoning of the Holocaust. There was no public appetite to investigate the private scandals of a dead prince. However, as the 20th century progressed and a new generation of historians began to aggressively examine the social mechanisms of the Weimar Republic, the sealed records of the 1922 trial were finally pulled from the darkness. What these researchers uncovered exposed not just the hypocrisy of a prince, but the terminal corruption of an entire legal system. While Eitel Friedrich lay safely shielded by marble in the antique temple, the legal weapon that briefly threatened him, paragraph 175, survived the fall of the Third Reich. For decades in post-war Germany, tens of thousands of ordinary citizens were systematically destroyed by the exact same legal machinery. It serves as the final bitter postscript to the prince's legacy. The Weimar justice system was never a measure of morality, but a precise measure of power and bloodline. The individuals caught in the center of this storm left behind legacies defined entirely by how they responded to this corrupt power structure. Emil Treschau remains a ghost in the historical record, a stark representation of the disposable working class. while entire libraries are filled with massive, detailed biographies of the Hohenzollern dynasty charting their every movement. The man who nearly brought them down was effectively erased. The justice system swallowed him whole. His disappearance is a sobering reminder that history is rarely written by the objective observer. It is curated by the victors, and the state archives meticulously preserve the triumphs of the elite while casually discarding the lives of the poor. Princess Sophia Charlotte of Oldenburg emerges as the only figure in this narrative who achieved a genuine moral victory. She was bred to be a silent victim, a decorative human shield placed in front of the prince to absorb the shock waves of his secret life. The establishment demanded that she suffer in quiet dignity until the day she died. By filing for divorce in 1926, she committed a profound act of rebellion. She looked at the absolute pinnacle of European society and decided it was a toxic, rotting institution that was no longer worth her sacrifice. She walked away from the wealth, the titles, and the suffocating prestige to reclaim her own humanity. She survived the Hohenzollern machine by boldly refusing to be a part of it. Then we are left with Prince Eitel Friedrich himself. He survived the blackmail. He survived the trial. He kept his freedom and his sprawling estates. But his survival was a completely hollow victory. To save his physical freedom, he was forced to permanently surrender his authenticity. He spent the remainder of his life performing a grotesque pantomime of extreme right-wing nationalism, aligning himself with violent paramilitary groups that hated everything he actually was. He chose to stand on balconies, wearing his medals, reviewing parades of men who would have gladly thrown him into a concentration camp if they had known the truth. He was a man who possessed the ultimate, unquestionable privilege of royal blood, yet he lacked the fundamental courage to stand by his own identity. He allowed his lover to be destroyed by the state, he allowed his wife to be deeply humiliated, and he allowed his own soul to be co-opted by fascists, all to protect a royal title that history was already in the process of deleting. We are drawn to the lives of royalty because they represent the absolute height of human privilege. But the life of Prince Eitel Friedrich reveals the dark, suffocating reality beneath the gold and the marble. He was born into the most powerful family in Europe, yet his legacy is defined by catastrophic miscalculations and moral decay. He stood in a courtroom convicted of financial corruption while ordinary Germans starved, watching as the immense machinery of elite power reduced his crimes to a meaningless fine. He dragged his own family through a devastating public scandal to protect his ego, and then aligned himself with violent fascist movements in a desperate, arrogant bid to reclaim his lost empire. Ultimately, the absolute power he spent his life trying to protect abandoned him entirely. He was sidelined by the Nazis, erased from the military history he worshipped, and died quietly in a forgotten estate while the world burned. His story forces us to recognize a harsh historical truth. The elite may rewrite the laws to protect their wealth, but they cannot escape the destructive consequences of the political monsters they help create.